At some point along your spiritual awakening, maybe after a profound realization or a personal collapse, something inside you shifted. You caught a glimpse behind the curtain, saw through the illusion, the conditioning, the noise. And then everything went quiet. At first it was profound. It felt like freedom, power, clarity. But slowly, that clarity started to fade. Not with drama, not with fireworks, but with silence, like your soul turned down the volume on life and never turned it back up. You stopped chasing, you stopped striving, not out of rebellion, just that quiet, breathless kind of surrender, the kind that sounds like an existential sigh. And then the questions started to creep in, just under the surface. Why do I feel emotionally empty now that I've finally come to understand the truth? Here's the contradiction no one warns you about. We expect awakening to set us on fire, to awaken passion, purpose, direction. But for many, it doesn't ignite anything. It empties everything out. Carl Jung saw this coming long before it became spiritual language. He didn't call it awakening, but he understood exactly what happens when the unconscious rises. He said, enlightenment doesn't come by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. It sounds poetic until you live it. Because awakening isn't the finish line. It's the unraveling, the psychological death of who you thought you were, the breakdown of the identity you built, the timelines you followed, the goals that gave you meaning. Even your sense of time itself begins to dissolve. But here's the twist. The ego doesn't vanish. It loses its bearings. Its map disintegrates. And without a new map, your drive evaporates. You're not lazy. You're not broken. You're simply in between. You've awakened from the illusion, but you haven't yet awakened into something new. And this is where most people get lost. Because what you're feeling isn't dysfunction. It's sacred, ancient, and necessary. The modern world avoids this phase at all costs. The sacred pause, the void, the liminal space between stories. But it's in this in-between that something real begins. No one talks about this part, do they? And that's exactly what we're about to dive into next. The truth of what's unfolding inside you after awakening, and how this strange, heavy quiet might not be a breakdown at all, but the beginning of the most meaningful transformation you've ever known. That fog you feel after awakening, the dullness, the drift, the quiet ache where your spark used to be. No, you're not losing your mind. You're in the middle of a shift so deep, most people don't even have words for it. It's not just a change in how you think. It's a full rewiring of how you exist. All the things that used to drive you, the lists, the plans, the hustle playlists that once lit a fire under you, they don't move you anymore. Not because you're lazy, not because you've given up, but because the engine that used to run on ego-fueled ambition is breaking down. And long before this ever hit your feed or became a buzzword, Carl Jung saw it coming. For most of your life, the part of you called the ego identity was steering the ship. The me you presented to the world, hungry to succeed, to be validated, to be seen as enough. That's not inherently wrong. It's a natural part of how we grow. Jung referred to it as the persona, the social mask we wear to play our role. But here's what awakening does. It rips the mask off. Suddenly, you're no longer interested in playing the game because you finally see the game. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. The goals you used to obsess over, they feel hollow now. They were built for a self that no longer feels real. You end up like an actor who's stepped off stage, costume in hand, realizing you don't remember your lines because they don't belong to you anymore. That's why you feel stuck. It's not because you've run out of energy. It's because the fuel you once burned, comparison, achievement, praise, no longer fits the vehicle you're becoming. Carl Jung believed our purpose isn't to eliminate the ego, but to integrate it, to align it with something deeper, something whole. He called this transformation individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you really are beneath the fragmentation. Not the ego's version of self-worth, but the deeper, timeless self, that soul-level center that's connected to all things. And that self? It doesn't care about applause. It doesn't crave clarity or validation. It exists to express truth, pure and simple. Once awakening starts to settle in, your inner world begins to rearrange itself. Anything inauthentic, anything built on proving or pretending, starts to fall away. That could mean a job, a role, a relationship, even the dreams you thought were aligned a year ago. That's why awakening feels both liberating and deeply disorienting. You feel like you've been set free, but also like you've been set adrift.
And here's the danger Jung warned us about. If you stop here, you can get stuck. Some people awaken and end up bypassing the real work. They say nothing matters, that it's all an illusion, and they float away from their life, disconnected and numb. They confuse letting go with giving up. But the self, the real self, doesn't want to escape the world. It wants to embody truth. It wants to show up through you. It wants to bring light into form, soul into skin, meaning into motion. But to get there, you have to pass through the middle. The strange, uncertain phase Jung understood well, though most people don't recognize it when they're in it. There's a stage after awakening that hardly anyone speaks about. It's not flashy. It doesn't make for viral quotes or spiritual selfies. It looks like this: sitting still, unable to explain what's happening inside you, while the rest of the world rushes on, pretending it knows where it's going. If you asked Carl Jung, he'd tell you, you're not lost, you're suspended. You've untethered from the ego but haven't yet anchored into the self. And this space you're in? It's not a setback, it's a sacred in-between. A liminal rite of passage. But in the world we live in, where doing is everything and stillness is suspect, this pause gets mislabeled. People call it laziness. They see your quiet as paralysis. And worse, you start believing them. You judge yourself for slowing down. And that judgment, it strangles the very energy your soul is quietly trying to call home. Jung had a name for this kind of inner reversal. He called it enantiodromia, the phenomenon where things swing into their opposite. When you awaken, that pendulum naturally shifts. You swing from the intensity of ego-driven achievement into a soul-level stillness. And as strange as it feels, this swing is holy. It's how equilibrium is restored. Every tradition, every myth hints at this moment, the hermit phase, the death before rebirth. This is where the ego starts to panic. It craves definition, direction, a role to play. But deep within, the self is murmuring something softer. Let it fall. I'm building something truer. The problem is, most modern spiritual teachings skip this part. They fast forward through the shadows with slogans, just follow your bliss, high vibes only. But Jung would tell you straight, if you avoid the darkness, you bury the gold with it. He believed the real journey is through shadow integration, facing the buried, uncomfortable parts of yourself, the anger, the fear, the grief you've labeled unworthy, not as an optional exercise, not as bonus material, but as the actual curriculum of becoming whole. And this space you're in right now, this emptiness that feels like failure, it's where the unconscious finally has room to breathe. You're not broken, you're processing, and your psyche, in its wisdom, knows exactly what it's doing. It puts your clarity on hold, it pulls the brakes on motivation. Not to punish you, but to force you to pause, to feel, to remember, to retrieve the pieces of yourself you once abandoned. That's the real work. And then something unexpected begins when you stop resisting the nothingness. It shifts, motivation starts to return, but it's different now. It's softer, quieter, not anxious, not performative. It doesn't come from pressure, it comes from depth. It's not a fire you light, it's a flame you rediscover, a sense of movement that feels like remembering, not chasing. Jung called this moment the emergence of the self, not as an abstract idea, but as a real, living compass that begins to guide your life from the inside. Now is where something new begins to stir. Not a lightning strike, not a grand awakening, just a subtle pull inward, a whisper that says, don't go back to old life. Build something new.
This is where the self begins to speak, not through logic or language, but through resonance, through nudges, through the quiet clarity that Jung described as the symbolic life, where meaning begins to emerge not from ego but from deep alignment. He believed that once the ego lets go of control and the unconscious is brought to light, we stop living from performance and start living from purpose. Here's something most people don't expect. When the self finally starts leading, life becomes beautifully simple, not flashy, not loud, just real. You stop running, you stop forcing. You're no longer pulled by the fear of missing out. You're moved by what genuinely resonates. You stop hunting for clarity like it's a prize. Instead, you just notice when it quietly arrives. Living from the self doesn't always feel like motivation in the way we've been taught to define it. There will still be days of tiredness, fog, maybe even sorrow. You're still human. But what fades away is that deep, constant friction, the quiet misery of pushing yourself through a life that doesn't feel like yours. Instead, you start to feel drawn, not pushed. Drawn to make things, to express something, even if no one sees it. You say no more easily to roles, routines, or paths that don't align, no matter how good they might look on paper. You trade your checklist for curiosity. You choose peace over performance. This is the new fuel. It's not the buzz of adrenaline, it's the pull of alignment. Carl Jung called this kind of living symbolic, not fantasy, not escapism, but soul-guided, where you begin to trust the imagery that rises from within. The dreams, the symbols, the gut feelings, the synchronicities, not as random noise, but as messages, as orientation. You stop trying to control life and start moving with it. You shift from domination to participation. And no, this doesn't mean ambition dies, it just evolves. Ambition becomes devotion to truth, to presence, to growth. And here's the irony, that kind of energy, it actually gets more done, but now it's sustainable, now it's soul-powered. This is what it means to be led by the self, not to impress, but to express, not to perform, but to contribute, to create, to teach, to build, to heal. Not because you should, but because everything inside you says yes. So if you've been feeling like your fire went out after awakening, maybe it did, but maybe it needed to, so a deeper flame could rise in its place, one that doesn't flicker when the winds of the world start to blow. Carl Jung never promised that awakening would be easy. And if you're still here, still listening, you're already walking that path. This journey isn't about reclaiming your old drive, it's about finding a new kind of purpose. One rooted not in performance, but in wholeness. This isn't the end of your awakening, it's the beginning of your becoming. If any part of this spoke to you, if it gave voice to something you've been holding inside, then I want you to write this comment below. Today, I choose alignment over performance. You can also go ahead and share your story. And if this kind of reflection resonates, then like this video and subscribe to the channel, because this isn't the end. It's the start of something real.